Army medicine as a whole in the human performance research space, there's not a lot of people who have spent time in those FORSCOM units to helping inform the research or to help them translate it. That's what I do a lot of now. I appreciate how you've talked about, different articles I've read, I've written, and all that stuff. I'm a mediocre scientist and have a mediocre publication record compared to some of my peers. Where I think I bring some value is translating it to that E5 or E6 squad leader, that drill sergeant. Okay, what does that mean to me today? Boil it down for me. What matters? Give me tools to inform my day-to-day decision making that can help. We still need to effectively train soldiers, but we don't want to break them.
Want to drop heat puns or something? All right, guys, the heat is on.
There you go. You just kicked it off. All right, guys, welcome. The heat is on. Things are heating up over here. It's getting hot. Who are we talking to, Alex?
This is a good one. We're talking to Dr./Lieutenant Colonel Dave DeGroot. He's a physiologist with a specialty in thermoregulation, which is how our bodies regulate temperature.
In case you didn't know.
And his focus within that is on how heat affects both health and performance. And Army people will appreciate the fact that he's the inventor of the arm immersion cooling system. So anybody who's been to basic training recently knows all about that. In his own words, it's just a bucket of cold water and a way to use it. He's consulted for numerous schools and commands across the Department of Defense on heat injury and heat illness prevention, recognition, and treatment. And despite his over 30 published journal articles, 4 textbook chapters, and dozens of conference presentations, he still thinks his writing ability is a work in progress. I kind of disagree. I thought his stuff was fascinating. I read a bunch of it before we brought him on. And he's got a background in strength and conditioning too. He's a CSCS and a USAW level 2. And he describes himself as an entirely mediocre weightlifting athlete. And you'll hear in the episode, he's also kind of a retired cyclist.
And he's like 6'2", 6'3". So for those of you that lift weights, you can imagine how interesting that is to try to snatch or clean and jerk at 6'3".
Yeah, not exactly built for the sport.
No, not at all. And we brought him on initially to talk about heat and kind of heat casualties and heat injury. But what you'll find towards sort of the back half of the podcast is that we do get into what I would consider some pretty interesting discussion around hydration and then kind of research in general, and his thoughts as a researcher and someone who's pretty deeply involved in the peer-reviewed research world. It's probably something that we'll dive more into down the line, but I think it's kind of a cool stepping off point for this idea of evidence-based practice versus sort of anecdotal based practice. We also this is the first episode. Well, maybe not the first, but it's probably the scariest in terms of audio, because we thought we lost Alex's audio file there for a little bit. Thankfully, it was only the first few minutes. So what Alex gets to now do is go back and record himself, pretending as though nothing happened. So here's the challenge to our listeners. If you guys can find where Alex screwed it up and has to then fake that he's totally normal, you'll win nothing. But you can, I don't know, tag him in Instagram or something like that.
And it's worth noting, we focused on a heat topic on this episode with Dave, but he's got published research on a bunch of other topics I think you guys would be interested in. He's got a really good systematic review on the validity of fitness standards for tactical professionals. He's got some work on postpartum recovery. He's got some work on how body composition affects both fitness and tactical performance, which is interesting because it's different between the two. The way it affects fitness testing is different than the way it does or does not affect tactical performance. And then perhaps most notably, he's an author on the study that led to the creation of the ACFT,
which was called
the Baseline Soldier Physical Readiness Requirements Study, BISPERS, highly encouraged to read it if you guys want to nerd out.
Yeah, Google it and read it, and then you can actually read the rebuttals and the replies to it from other institutions.
There's many of them. There's at least 3 that I've read.
Well, enjoy. I have a toddler, so Alex gets to do the editing. So if anything comes back and you hate it, it's all his fault, basically.
There we go. Good to know.
Hold on, I'm looking for y'all go ahead. I'm looking for a computer charger. I know, like I don't want this to die since I have all the audio.
Yeah, if I get a background noise, I've got a 22-year-old, a teenager, and 2 dogs. So there could be any sorts of chaos on the other side of the bedroom door at any point.
I got you beat by 1 dog. I've got 3, and they've figured out how to navigate the baby gate. So it very well may be.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it's a great time. Where was the other end? Sorry, forgive me.
So while Drew figures his life out, I'll try and get things rolling by asking. So I've been experimenting with myself in terms of how to train in the heat more and more. And I've had lots of conversations with other people in terms of how heat influences their training. It's been an interesting process, but there's a lot of it that I don't understand because there are a ton of variables involved. I'd love to know from your perspective, because a lot of your work surrounds exertional heat injury, what does the Army do well and what do we not do so well in terms of approaching the issue of heat?
I think we do a really good job of just our general awareness of heat as a threat, as something that needs to be mitigated. But where we have a long way to go is what we actually do in those mitigation steps. We put a lot of emphasis on hydration, but that's only one of, I could list a dozen different risk factors. And just because we've mitigated that one doesn't negate all the others. So that's an area where we definitely need to do better, and recognizing, as I've learned, and by background, I'm a physiologist by training. I once had a mentor when I was getting my master's degree who jokingly referred to himself as a cut off the head physiologist. Just leave me the brainstem, because everything we study in physiology is reflex driven. I don't need higher levels of thought. I just need reflexes to work, because thermoregulation is all reflex driven. But that discounts, and what I've come to realize is the behavioral aspect, because we also engage in behavioral thermoregulation. The simplest example, what's behavioral thermoregulation? Drew, you're saying you got a couple dogs. What do they do when they're hot? When they're laying out in the yard, they stretch out.
Yeah, drool all over you as well.
Well, yeah. Well, they're stretching out. What are they doing? They're maximizing their body surface area that's exposed to dissipate heat. What's an animal do when it's cold? It curls up into a ball to minimize its body surface area to minimize heat loss. Those are both behavioral things that they're doing. We do it too in how we choose our clothing, but also how we choose how hard we're going to push it on a run or a ruck or any sort of other type of physical exertion. We have a long way to go there, and we have a lot of cultural challenges.
Well, a couple that I found really interesting. One, and this goes back to me being a lieutenant at Fort Carson, but it seemed like we had more heat injuries from physical training during the summer, unsurprisingly, but then we had more heat injuries from tactical training during the winter. And that had a lot to do with bad choices on how many layers of insulation to wear. People would dress for being warm when they were sitting still, but then they'd start a movement and rapidly overheat. That was fascinating to me. And then the other piece is, and this was especially true at Fort Jackson once I got there, we were extremely strict about what physical training you could do in the heat, but we still did the normal tactical training regardless of what the heat situation was. Some modifications, sure, but the mission had to get completed. I feel like PT could be a good opportunity for graded exposure to heat so that people can actually acclimate, but we missed that opportunity because of all the safety stuff we put in place. And I'm not sure what the best practices are in those situations.
Yeah, and actually, to springboard off your comment there, PT should be a graded exposure to the heat, because to become heat acclimatized, you need not just exposure, but some level of exertion in the heat. And well, you get it during PT. You just need to be smart about it. To talk about your comment at Carson, I did a study a couple of years back at a previous duty station looking at the distribution of heat casualties across the calendar year. And one for the 10 bases we studied, which was the top 10 for the number of heat casualties, 1 out of every 6 heat casualties was in the winter months. Because it's not just the environment, it's the clothing and the activity level. And just as you alluded to, Alex, if someone overdresses, they can become a heat casualty in the winter months. I remember when I used to do some cold weather injury prevention training, the guidance is when you first step outside, you actually want to be a little bit chilly. Because once you get moving, you're going to be fine. If you step outside and walk out the door and you're going to be doing you're up at Fort Campbell to earn your air assault badge, and you walk out the door to head over to the schoolhouse and you're comfortable, you're overdressed. Because once you start moving, which is why, like, as a best practice, I've had the chance to visit up there. That's one of the things they do. They'll do a uniform inspection before they step off on that 12-mile rock. I was up there in April and it was like 38 degrees in the morning, and they're like, nope, OCPs, t-shirt, nothing else, no snivel gear, not allowed, take it off. And they enforced it before they'd start the event because they knew from experience that if they let those guys overdress like that, they were going to become a heat casualty, even though by the time the event ended, temperatures were still just in the 40s. I
had heard a guy that I used to work with, his mantra, I guess, was start cold anytime you're doing an activity. Yeah. And it stuck with me because it actually, to your point, makes a lot of sense. And you may be uncomfortable at the outset, but everybody knows that within a matter of minutes, you kind of regulate.
Exactly. Yep.
So aside from, I know you talk about clothing, what other kind of low-hanging fruit makes someone susceptible to becoming a heat casualty?
What we found where I'm working now is the type of event. If they're timed events, most of our heat strokes are during ruck marches and runs, and more so when the clock is ticking. It's a POI event. This is to earn a badge or a tab, to stay in a program, to advance through basic, that there's some external motivator to keep pushing it. What we often see a lot also, in addition to the motivation, is some underlying illness. Because what people don't realize is heat stress itself is an immune stressor. And of course, you're going to have the natural hypothermia of exercise. You're going to have a rise in your body temperature anyway. So now imagine that before that, whatever your activity is starts, you've got someone who's a little bit sick and is running a low-grade fever. So 2 things. Well, their baseline temperature, their starting temperature is elevated a little bit, and they already have an immune challenge going. So now you're hitting they call it a dual hit hypothesis for, we actually don't have a working mechanism for what causes heat stroke. We have some theories, some of which are very good. One of which is that it's an immune, there's an immune component to it. So if you get someone who's already sick, even if it's just like an upper respiratory infection or a little GI illness from something you ate, and you don't have a choice, because actually we have a case report in press in the journal right now of a guy who had some lower GI thing. He had been sick for a little while, self-medicating with Imodium because he's got the trots, and he's going to arrange a school report date. He's not going to give that up. He's coming TDY from somewhere. He's not going to give up that slot for that school that he's been training for because he's had a little lower GI issues. Well, in a drug like Imodium AD, one of the, whoever reads the very fine print on the product insert, right? Nobody. One of the risk factors, one of the side effects possibly of Imodium AD is reduced heat loss and increased risk of heat illness. Sure enough, that's what happened to this guy. So it's never any one thing. It's usually some constellation of a couple things.
Yeah, I'm not super read up on all, because you hear about this, at the end of just about every summer football training season of, somebody or another going down, and they always tend to link it back, not always, but frequently it gets linked back, like you said, to some sort of medication or some other underlying issue. And It's that annual conversation around heat and what it's doing to athletes.
Yeah. I'm not sure what your question is there.
No, it's more of just a thought, because I think it's interesting to listen to you talk about, the underlying physiology that takes place, the addition of these kind of cofactors when we think of medication. But then I think the other really insightful point is that it's not always summer. I mean, you've seen it happen more often in winter where people are overheating, and it's just unpacking kind of. I know one of your papers on fact versus fiction when it comes to heat. It's interesting to hear that, because we always associate it with, if you talk to somebody about heat illness, they're thinking, okay, summer football practice, dump Gatorade on them, XYZ. And it seems like that's a little bit misaligned, or not misaligned, but just a little bit of a mythology.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do when we have the opportunity to talk with someone who had a serious heat illness event, particularly a heat stroke, is they often, someone who suffered a heat stroke, they want to know why, not just why, but why me? Because the rest of their platoon, the rest of their company is continuing training, but they're at the hospital. What the hell was different for that person on that day that they're now out of training, they're a medical drop or recycle or whatever, and no one else in their class, no one else in their platoon or company was affected in the same way? So we always want to interview them for us to gain an understanding, because that helps inform what we try and do on the prevention side of things. But it also helps that person understand what happened to them, so that they know, what can I do differently next time so that this doesn't happen to me again.
I'll take this chance, because I don't think most listeners would know, but so like Dr. DeGroot works with the Warrior Heat and Exertion Collaborative, and there's some really in-depth work that happens after a soldier experiences an exertional heat injury to determine like whether they are like fit and healthy enough to return to full duty, whether it was something about their innate physiology that led to the heat injury, or whether it was like a combination of factors and what they were exposed to and things like that. And it involves a significant amount of resource investment in that individual soldier, of like putting them through some really robust physiological testing. Exposure to heat during physical activity stuff happens like in a highly monitored situation where you're looking at core body temperature and sweat rate and all sorts of crazy things. There's a lot of effort put into this problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, Alex, because the vast majority of our heat casualties don't require that intensive testing. There's the very few, I hesitate to put a percentage on it, but I'd certainly put it down in the single digit percentages, who for some reason or another, after a heat illness event, struggle to return to pre-illness performance levels. And those are the challenging ones of, okay, why aren't you bouncing back like everyone else does? Is it because you had something pre-existing that's just part of your physiology? Or is it because your physiology has been negatively affected by that heat illness event? And that's where we don't know a lot. And that's where it can get really challenging. We're trying to tease those out. The people who aren't progressing normally for their return to duty process.
Do you find, because I'm thinking, and I know it's not a one-to-one, but the conversation around concussions, and if you've had a concussion before, you're more susceptible, to repeated exposures. Is the same true with heat, or is it often just that it can be a one-off based on like some of the things that we've talked about? I guess the question there is, if you have been a heat cat before, are you more likely to become one again?
Yeah, and that's a great question. The standard Army answer is going to be, yeah, if you're a prior heat casualty, hey, raise your hand. We need to know who you are, because you're at greater risk.
Yeah, put the letter on your helmet.
Yeah, something like that. But the reality is, even pointed out in a New England Journal of Medicine review article from, I want to say 3 years ago, that pointed out that the scientific literature is not in agreement on that point. That there's a lot of good animal heat stroke model data that when they sacrifice the animal and do their thing with the histology, looking at the regions of the brain, there's no changes. There's nothing there. So I think part of our challenge in answering that question is because we've gotten better at treating heat casualties. I'm sure you guys are familiar with just using ice sheets, bed linen soaked in ice water as a standard. Well, that practice has only been around for about 20 years. What about that guy who was a heat stroke in the 80s or 90s and didn't get cooled until he got to the hospital? He was hotter for longer. We know from the literature that the hotter you are and the longer the dose of heat you get, the worse the outcomes. Not just the incidence of death, but also comorbid conditions that are a result of that. So how much of our understanding of the risk of repeated heat strokes is based off of old data that really doesn't apply anymore, because we do so much better now at recognizing and responding, getting that suspected heat casualty cooled off quick. We've looked at where I work at now, which I'll keep vague for our listeners so I don't get in trouble. Like 85 or 90% of the casualties, by the time they reach the emergency room doors, have been cooled enough that they can stop active cooling measures. That the EMS, now the emergency department's just like, okay, we're just observing and doing vital signs and running some labs, and the hard work was done before they even got to the hospital. I would bet that in those cohorts, there's no greater risk down the line. But that's my anecdotal opinion that we don't have good science on yet. Someday I hope to, but right now we're not there.
I almost wonder, and I don't even know how you would really test this, but I almost think that you might be less susceptible to a reoccurrence, because that would be in some cases a bit of a traumatic experience, and you would go out of your way to take preventative steps anytime you get in the same situation.
Exactly. You know, I talked a little while ago about where we talk with that individual to get a good understanding of what happened to them, and for them to understand, well, what's one of the best teachers? Experience, right? And so it doesn't have to be good experience. Sometimes it's a real crappy negative experience and you learn your lesson. And especially as we're gaining that insights into motivation. Just a quick example of that. A couple months ago, had the opportunity to speak with a sergeant first class, I believe. He was either staff sergeant or sergeant first class, early to mid 30s, and finally got his shot to go to Ranger School. And I was talking to him at some later point. He had suffered a heat stroke during that first week of Ranger School. I was talking to him, and how was it going? And he freely offered it that, yeah, I wasn't having a good day. Around mile 9, I was just feeling beat up. And frankly, if I had been home and this was just a training ruck, I would have just called it. Or I would have taken a break or just walked slower and just like, you know what, some days it is what it is. Some days you just, for whatever reason that he couldn't identify, he goes, I didn't have a choice. It's day 4 at Ranger School. I'm going to put my head down and keep moving. And kept moving into a heat stroke. I when I talk about these, we also want to be careful where it sounds like we can veer into the territory of blaming the victim. But there does have to be some level of their own accountability, of their own responsibility because the behavioral piece does come back to the person. But we can understand that, yeah, this is an early 30s, NCO who's finally gotten a shot at the school that he really wants, to earn a tab he really wants. He's motivated. You really can't blame the guy for that decision.
That brings up a question that I have, and we've touched on this a lot in different interviews that we've had with different people around the idea of kind of the biopsychosocial nature of training. And I don't want to lead people into thinking you can like grit out a heat situation, but have you seen any incidences where, even if it's anecdotally, like there is a mental component to it, and if someone goes into a training event, not feeling their best psychologically or otherwise, they're more susceptible? Or is it entirely physiological, entirely based on your environment, if that makes sense?
No, it does make sense, and it's a mix.
Mm-hmm.
There's often gonna be a behavioral piece. To further illustrate that one, I can think of an example of an individual I spoke with. This is a couple of years ago. This was actually a woman trying to earn her Ranger tab. Of course, right where are we at in the Army right now? A little over 100 women have succeeded in.
Just over 100.
Yeah, just over 100 or so have successfully earned the Ranger tab. And this was a couple of years ago, so this was earlier on. And I asked her she had her heat stroke on day one on the 5 mile run Monday morning, and asked her, how was the run going until you collapsed? And she goes, well, through 2 miles, I was on a personal best pace. And right away I was like, oh crap, well, there's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's where I've talked with leadership at different schools. And this comes back to some of my background. I've got some background in strength and conditioning and as a weightlifting coach. And a phrase I learned from a fellow coach is, or actually a rhetorical question, not a phrase. What's the most important training day? Tomorrow. The answer is always going to be tomorrow. And if whatever you do today impairs your ability to train tomorrow, today was not a good training day. And for something like Ranger School, you've got 62 training days. And your job every day is to make it through to tomorrow. And sometimes what that means is you approach a certain event as a check the box exercise. All I need to do is get a go at this station and move on. There's no award for finishing the 5 mile run first, or in her case, being the fastest woman in the class. Yet she was out the door on a personal best pace through 2 miles. So then to come back to that story, I asked her, okay, well, what about the rest of it? Well, I don't remember. She collapsed. She collapsed somewhere past the 4 mile mark. She doesn't remember. There's always some transient amnesia, especially with someone who loses consciousness as part of the heat stroke event. And there's 15 or 20 minutes. She's a blank slate. She's got nothing. Her next waking memory is she's in the ambulance under ice sheets and some funny remarks about, what did she say? I woke up, I was naked under ice sheets and had a rectal probe in my butt. What a way to wake up. But that was her first memory from after the 2 mile marker. So certainly her motivation played a role in that. She was feeling probably, and she and I talked about this afterwards, of being one of very few women in that Ranger School class. There's a societal pressure. She wanted to represent well. She's a woman in the infantry trying to earn a Ranger tab. She's motivated to, from my perspective, and she and I spoke about this, perhaps even excessively so, when she didn't need to be, because the pace she was on was more than a minute per mile faster than it was needed to pass the event. She didn't have to be that fast. And if she had simply just slowed it down to, instead of I'm going to finish in 34 minutes, I'm going to finish in 39. Now, we can't guarantee that she still wouldn't have been a heat stroke. But the fact that she was PRing her 5 mile run in July at Fort Benning doesn't bode well.
Yeah. That's something we've talked about on this podcast previously. And I think it's something, this is circling back to like the graded exposure concept of like using PT to acclimate yourself. But I think the Army, and in my experience doing PT, we're not very good at any effort level below maximum.
That's right.
Like the idea of doing a run that is not like a threshold run is not something that many organizations within the Army have like embraced or I can conceptualize yet. And I think there's a huge, the safety answer is just don't run when it's hot, because we don't trust you to figure out the other variables.
Yeah.
We'll keep it simple.
And that's not reality.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity to just train at a lower intensity, still get a good training effect and get a heat acclimation effect. I just don't know how we like prescribe that to the force in a way that's simple enough to be actionable.
Yeah, and that goes back to my comment earlier about the cultural challenges. It's just the culture of the Army, of the whole suck it up and drive on. To some extent, we want them to do that. We need that trainee. Think back to your officer basic, or for myself, I'm also on prior enlisted. To build their physical and psychological resilience, you got to push them out of their comfort zone. But you go too far, and that's where you start breaking people. And you don't have to get way out of that comfort zone every time you train. And that's a big cultural barrier we've got, and we've got a long way to go there.
Do you, I mean, from like a purely exercise prescription standpoint, if you know, and I'm trying to like offer up a nugget for folks that want to maybe go after that idea of, graded exposure and
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote training for the heat. So like if I'm sitting there and it's the middle of summer and I know it's going to be, I mean, here in North Carolina, like mid to high 90s and humid, which I have other questions about the humidity component of this, and I'm thinking of the best way to go about, throughout that week, maybe putting together components of my training plan to effectively expose myself to the heat. What does that look like from an X's and O's standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it doesn't have to be higher intensity. People get thrown off by the standard heat acclimatization guidelines that talk about 1 to 2 hours a day for 7 to 10 days. Oh, 1 to 2 hours, that's a lot. Well, we're talking about brisk walking. It doesn't have to be running. It doesn't have to be higher intensity. Enough to moderately raise your core temperature and break a good sweat and then sustain that for an hour or so. Well, on a 90-degree day, I just walk at 4 miles an hour, 15 minutes a mile. You're going to do that easily. That's all it takes. In terms of a graded progression, just to tolerance, now this is where it gets a little difficult, because of course everyone's different, right? In terms of their baseline conditioning. But from wherever you're starting, adding a little bit more duration each day. You don't have to mess too much with the intensity because it's at best moderate intensity, and just add some duration. Okay, the first day I'm going to do 30 minutes, then I'm going to do 40 and then 50 and get over an hour and do that for a week and you're there. It's not terribly difficult. We've made it sound difficult sometimes because there are people who do research on how can we compress the time frame required to heat acclimatize. I'm a leader at, well, take you where you are over at Fort Bragg, take someone over at SOCOM, and we're deploying on 3 days notice to a hot environment. What can we do in a shorter amount of time? Different protocols to accelerate heat acclimatization. And yeah, then we get into some other nuances. But just, for your average Joe, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's just interesting because you hear so much about altitude work and how you can, grade your exposure to altitude and prepare to be up high and sleep low, train high, sleep low. But like the heat conversation is an interesting one because I would argue that affects more. There are more people training in 90+ degree heat than there are going up to 20,000 plus feet. And the conversation from a like elite performance standpoint, and it may just be that I'm unfamiliar with the research on the heat side, but everything seems to trend towards altitude versus heat.
Yeah, I think you're right. We've probably done a little better job on that graded stuff when it comes to altitude because it's easy to grade altitude. It's the elevation you're at. It's pretty discrete that you put someone at 8,000 feet. We know the barometric pressure and we can quantify the decrement of performance. There's so much more individual variability, I think, in the heat at a given environmental conditions, depending on, well, what's the activity level, what's the clothing, what's their acclimatization state, what's their hydration. My sense is, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble with someone who knows the altitude physiology better than I do, that I'm oversimplifying it. And I once spent the entire summer working out at Pikes Peak. I should know better, but I don't. I think to some extent you're right there that, we do have a good understanding of what graded altitude and how to acclimatize. You just look at all the successful higher, the Great Mountains ascents, that it's practically a recipe. Do it this way and you're going to get there for most people.
I just, in my head, I'm visualizing, because obviously people sleep in altitude tents, and I'm visualizing a world where some, gung-ho dude is sleeping in like a heat tent, and that just seems like a miserable experience.
Yeah, it does.
It does bring up a question. Are there performance benefits to be had? And I want to make sure I phrase this right. Are there performance benefits to be had for training in like an over hot environment? And I may have just made that word up, but like if I exist here in this climate, do I gain anything from training in a hotter climate in the same way that I might gain something from training at a higher altitude when you talk about, VO2 and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, in terms of So I'm going to say probably, because I'm not quite sure someone's actually studied. Well,
Yeah, I may have just made that question up, but it's an interesting.
no.
thought
It
experiment.
actually is a valid one, because when you look at heat acclimatization protocols, what some studies have done, and I can't cite any off the top of my head here, but at the end of an acclimatization, they also will test them back in a temperate, just a normal environment. One of the things we talk about with heat acclimatization is it's specific to the environment you're in. So, where I'm at in Georgia right now, we're consistently hitting the 90s. You take me out to, what is it, Fort Irwin, the LTC, and it's up into the hundreds. I'm not acclimatized. I'm currently acclimatized to 90 degrees and humid. You take me to 105 and dry, I still have a little bit more acclimatization. I'm not quite there. But that is an interesting question, that if you acclimatize, say, to 105 or 110, but to perform at 90 degrees, is that going to be beneficial then to just training at 90?
Yeah.
If I'm following your question, I don't know if anyone's ever looked at it that way. They've looked at it in terms of acclimatization to a specific environment, then testing, like post acclimatization testing back in that temperate, your nice, comfortable 70 degrees type
Yeah.
thing.
If someone takes that for a PhD, I want credit, because now that I'm
There we go.
now that I'm thinking through that process, I'm like, man, we do so much. I mean, because really, even folks that don't ever go to altitude, a ton of folks in the track world will train at different oxygen levels, and you reap all the extra benefits and lung capacity. And I just wonder if someone's going to get hurt trying that, but I still want credit for it. You mentioned it there, and for myself, previously I lived in Arizona, where it's multiple hundreds of degrees, but there's zero humidity. And now, less hot, but more humid. In your experience with heat casualties and just sort of heat research in general, what role does humidity play?
It plays a very large role. Now, I sometimes I've had to counter some messaging from a previous colleague who
We're turning up the heat here.
yeah, he overemphasized to this individual humidity was the only thing that mattered in terms of environmental parameters. And that's not the case. In fact, I have over my shoulder here, my little stack of reading, I just came across a systematic review of indices to quantify physiological heat strain. And over the last 2 millennia, they have identified 340 different ways to quantify the environment. Right? And then it's actually a series of 3 papers, and in the third one, they actually put a bunch of them to the test using retrospective data and looking at injury, and it's not the best. Well, there's room for improvement, but of the tools we have available, it comes back to WBGT.
I was going to say,
it's not just the heat, and it's also the humidity, and it's the solar radiation. It's all 3 of them.
300 ways to quantify the environment.
Yeah, I haven't read the paper sitting here. It's in my to read pile. I just found the paper last week. It was just published last month. It's a very dense paper that I haven't worked my way through just yet. But from the abstract, holy crap, 340.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So to come back to just for the audience too, some primer on some of the basic biophysics of heat and humidity, why it matters for us. The closer the air temperature gets to our body temperature, or actually more specifically our skin temperature, the more we rely on exclusively evaporation of sweat. If it's 95 degrees out, the only way you can lose heat is through the evaporation of sweat. Radiation and convection have basically gone to zero because skin temperature and air temperature are the same. There's no heat loss that way. All that's left is the evaporation of sweat. And if it's also very humid and there's not a vapor pressure gradient, you're screwed. Frankly, there does become a level where certain levels of activity become unsustainable once you get to a certain there are certain thresholds. Now, again, it all depends on what's the acclimatization status of the person, what's their fitness, what other clothing are they wearing, what is the activity level. So all those still play in, but we still have the overall challenge is there's no way to biophysically transfer that heat from the body to the environment. It's lost if it's both hot and humid.
Do you find that more heat casualties occur in hot and dry versus less hot and humid?
Nah, they more certainly in humid. And that's why, people roll their eyes at the WBGT, but that's a weighted average, and 70% of that weighted average is the wet bulb, which is our indicator of wet bulb temperature is an indicator of absolute humidity. And that's 70% of that weighted average. So that really tells you a lot about the role of humidity in heat stress and our ability to dissipate heat.
That's something I hadn't really thought too much. I noticed, this is like a weird personal example, but I'm in Colorado briefly, and I went for a run yesterday and found it to be much easier than I expected it to be. The temperature was pretty warm, like 80-ish. And I've been doing lots of runs in Virginia where it's in the 80s and humid. And I thought the altitude would kick my butt coming to Colorado from really low elevation, but just the lack of humidity led to the run feeling extremely easy compared to what I've been experiencing in the humidity of Virginia. It was fascinating.
And probably made that easier disproportionately more so than the altitude made it tougher. Where in Colorado are you?
Colorado Springs.
You're in the Springs. Okay, so you're around 6,000 feet.
Yep.
Yeah, so you're just getting at the cusp of just high enough to start being having some physiological decrements, but they're not as great as the performance improvements because it's drier.
Yeah, I was
That makes sense.
I was running like faster and on like a longer distance than usual and on hills, and still experienced like a noticeably lower heart rate for the effort that I was putting out. And
yeah, that's the role of the humidity.
yeah.
See, I think I'm onto something with this idea. Maybe it's you sleep in a humidity tent. And I'm sitting next to my wife's houseplants, and there is a humidifier running. So I like to think that I'm going to reap a lot of performance benefits from just recording this podcast even. I also appreciate Alex with the subtle flex of how long and fast and hilly you ran. And
right.
Easy. So hey, it felt really good. I've been posting the stupid heart rate data screenshots on my Instagram story all the time. And it felt good.
You and I commented on one of them last week. You and I were talking on Instagram about it.
Yeah. Because I've been getting all nerdy about it. Like in the last couple of weeks, I did the same run, like exactly the same route at like a similar pace, but like slightly different heat and humidity conditions and like different hydration status for me, and like replicating a similar distance here. It was pretty fun. I don't know. That's nerdier than most people probably want to get, but I enjoy it.
We've touched on this a little bit around like hydration as it pertains to heat. And I know, especially in the tactical space, I mean, you've got any number of powders, supplements, whatever that you can add to make, some magical beverage that makes you, I guess what I'm getting at here is from a performance standpoint, if someone is going into what will be a hot environment, something they may or may not have acclimatized to, what kind of guidelines do you have when it comes to hydration, rehydration, cooling yourself off? Is it just water? Do we add, powders? Do we look to supplement? Like, go crazy with that?
Sure. Yeah. So really, there's really two different considerations we need to think about. That we often conflate those, but they are in fact different things. The first is performance sustainment. Alex talking about your experience going on a run and wanting to rehydrate. And how long earlier in life, I'm getting old and broken these days, but I used to be a roadie cyclist. Wouldn't be much at all for me on a Saturday or Sunday morning to go out for 40 or 50 miles on my road bike. Certainly refueling, rehydrating and fueling are important. Once you get an activity over an hour, 90 minutes, you've started to, if it's higher intensity, you're really depleting your muscle and liver glycogen stores. You got to be ingesting something with some carbohydrate. Pick your beverage of your choice of all your different brands of carbohydrate electrolyte beverages out there. But in terms of heat illness prevention, that's separate from performance sustainment, because here's what we've learned in the heat illness prevention space is that hydration is certainly contributory as a risk factor for heat exhaustion, more so than it is a risk factor for heat stroke. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are not on a continuum of pathophysiology. They're on a spectrum of severity, but a heat exhaustion untreated doesn't become a heat stroke. They're different events. And the fact is, where I'm at now, we see a number of heat strokes who are normally hydrated. That's why I come back to the whole message of there's other risk factors at play. Certainly, in terms of the different beverages that are out there, and there's the much higher sodium content ORS type things, Pedialytes and others. To some extent, that stuff is to drink to what tastes the best to you and is going to encourage continued drinking behavior. Ad libitum fluid intake works. I once actually in between Army. I'm dumb enough. I joined the Army twice. I had a 4-year break in service while I was getting my PhD. And I actually had the opportunity to work with people from the Gatorade labs. And you know what one of the best post-workout recovery drinks is?
I hope it's chocolate milk, but
it's chocolate milk. But how palatable is that after a workout? Or to someone who's got lactose issue? Not really, is it?
yeah.
So, but from a composition standpoint, it checks all the boxes. That's what the sports beverage industry is trying to mimic, but in a more palatable form that encourages continued drinking behavior. Who wants to slug down a pint of milk in the middle of a long run? Ugh, my stomach's upset thinking about it, right? And see the face that Drew's making doesn't.
I'm just picturing, because I do some
Right?
cycling as well, and I'm picturing a water bottle full of milk.
Right? It's gross. Who wants that?
Yeah, not good.
Yeah. So short duration stuff, under an hour. We don't really need to be too concerned about rehydration. Now, if you have multiple short duration things over the course of a day, now we need to start thinking a little more holistically about your whole day and what are you doing here. But if you're, let's face it, I work an office job and I work out in my garage gym when I get home in the evening. I don't have to worry too much about my refueling, my rehydrating while I'm working out. When I'm done, refuel then, check my body weight in the morning. Oh crap, I'm down 2 pounds overnight. Oops, didn't rehydrate well yesterday. Catch up a little bit here. It's for the endurance athletes or for the soldier in training or in any sort of or even in a tactical scenario where you've got that low intensity sustained for multiple hours. Certainly carbohydrate electrolyte beverage of your choice, Gatorade, Powerade, whatever else is certainly appropriate. Something right around, some of my former colleagues would kill me for this sort of overgeneralization because they've come up with these really detailed sweat rate prediction equations that you can precisely estimate how much fluid that you need to take. But as a starting point, tell people to drink about a quart an hour and you're going to do fine. During the course of, say you're training to do a 12-mile foot march, drink a quart an hour and you're going to keep your dehydration to within 1% of body weight. And that's not going to have any negative impact on performance.
So I'll ask a question this is going to seem like a different topic and it's like a tiny bit more philosophical, but you've mentioned in the last couple of minutes your own experience as a cyclist and your own experience with weightlifting and all these things. And I think we can comfortably say that not all research physiologists do a ton of their own training necessarily. How does your experience training yourself shape kind of your research interests and like what research you find useful and how you give recommendations to people and things like that?
Yeah, it's certainly as my past history as a cyclist, and I'm sorry, I'm in my early 50s and my arthritic knees don't agree with that. I'm one of those, I'm permanent profile and I put my butt on the rower for the 5K twice a year and I'm good. But as a cyclist, it just those longer duration events gave me some insights I've never served in the infantry. I'm a career medical command guy. I haven't spent a day in the field since officer basic. I haven't slept on the ground in 15 years. It's not what the Army asks of me. But I do bring to it my experience as a past life endurance athlete. There's a lot of translation to that for someone who's trying to train for that 12-mile foot march to earn air assault or ranger or EFMB or EIB. A lot of the physiological principles carry over, just the general training experience. And when I deployed, Mideast, nice and hot, and trying to function in body armor. So try and be a little more well-rounded than I don't want to speak negatively of some of my medical service corps peers, but some of them have never stepped foot outside of a lab and don't have a clue what it's like. I think my prior experience enlisted gives me a little bit of insights that some of my peers don't necessarily have.
Do you find that it could be in the heat space, really in any of the fields that you've done research, do you find that there is ever a disconnect between what might come out of a lab in terms of best practices versus what anecdotally works in the field? And I guess what I'm getting at here is a question that Alex and I have kind of chased a couple of different times around the disconnect between research versus practice, especially in this field of human performance. And the heat one is incredibly interesting to me because you do see a lot of guidelines come out and do this, and this. And then, like we discussed earlier, it's like, if you're super motivated and you've got to pass that event, like, you're going to throw that stuff out the window. And what I'm wondering is if there's maybe a better way, or maybe there's just sort of a best practice that you've seen around research and performance where that bridge can be gapped or crossed, so to speak.
Yeah, there's several things I think about as you mention that, and I think that is a drawback to some of our Army medicine as a whole in the human performance research space. There's not a lot of people who have spent time in those force comm units to helping inform the research or to help them translate it. That's what I do a lot of now. I appreciate how you've talked about, different articles I've written and all that stuff. I'm a mediocre scientist and have a mediocre publication record compared to some of my peers. Where I think I bring some value is translating it to that E5 or E6 squad leader, that drill sergeant. Okay, what does that mean to me today? Boil it down for me. What matters? Give me tools to inform my day-to-day decision making that can help. We still need to effectively train soldiers, but we don't want to break them. And things like, and I'm going to pick on a colleague she's a tremendous friend and colleague, and I have tremendous respect for all her work. But your average combat arms guy doesn't give two craps about minute differences in thermoregulation between men and women, because some paper found that there's a couple tenths of a degree difference in the core temperature response, and it's different between men and women. That combat arms guy doesn't give a crap about that. It's meaningless to him. And maybe it's because it's this is where it can be one of two things, or maybe a mix. Is it because there's a scientist who's chasing after a question that ultimately is kind of meaningless to the warfighter? Or are they doing a bad job of communicating why it should be important to them and they don't understand it? Or maybe a little bit of both.
Have you seen, because from a human performance standpoint, again, and we've talked in the past about data and wearables, and what I'm seeing is almost a breaking down of every component of performance, and then an investment in each one of those things. And from a research standpoint, you see that in the literature where people are diving down these really deep and significant or insignificant opinion, topics. Have you seen that problem get worse as the body of research has expanded, or have you seen that problem get better in the sense that we are starting to answer questions that maybe the end user athlete has or may have without knowing, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think it's very much it depends kind of things. A good scientist is also going to be able to explain why their work matters. Now, granted, there are some people working in the very basic science research space where it's very difficult to understand, to apply to practical everyday life, because that's not the question they're trying to get at. Where the lab I trained in with where some of my classmates in the lab, people I trained with, really getting deep into the weeds with the neurotransmitter control of vasoconstriction and vasodilation in response to heat and cold stress and how those change with aging, and really deep in the weeds understanding of that stuff is hard to apply to someone in every day, but it gives us a greater understanding of mechanisms that can later translate. Yeah, that's because there's so many journals and so many people wanting to publish. There is a lot of stuff out there, and I come to this also. I'm an ad hoc reviewer for half a dozen journals. I'm on the editorial board of one. There's a lot of mediocre stuff out there well, who cares? You haven't told me. Seriously, I mean,
I agree 100%.
One journal I review for has an acceptance rate of about 25%. A vast majority of what gets rejected, it's not because it's not appropriate for the journal, it's bad science. Or they haven't even tried to frame right from the outset in the introduction, why does this question you're trying to answer matter? How is this filling a void in our knowledge, or has helping clear up a area of ambiguity in the literature? Some sort of meaningful contribution. And there's just a lot of stuff that fails. Now, there's a lot of good science out there. There's a lot of really good journals. But oh boy, there's a lot of mediocre stuff.
I saw a social media post just a couple hours before we got on this call of like we've entered an era in the human performance industry where like every charlatan arrives with reams of research that supposedly supports what they're trying to argue for. And it like the post takeaway is that like the phrase evidence-based almost doesn't matter anymore, because you can find some evidence somewhere for any claim you want to make. There's just a much larger conversation about what's relevant and useful.
Yeah, so easy to pick and choose a paper. Just like, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, then there's papers that have leveraged that, and you can find a paper that says probably darn near anything. Doesn't mean it was a well done paper in a appropriately peer reviewed, or was peer reviewed, but by people who maybe shouldn't have any business doing peer review. That's why I'm becoming more and more of a fan of systematic reviews and meta-analyses.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this whole conversation, and one of my favorite things to read about is like, so John Ioannidis, I don't know if you're familiar, he researches meta-analyses, and he has a paper about why most published research findings are false. And he gets into this exact thing of like, and I can only speak about the human performance field because it's what I've done my whole career, but you almost blanketly assume that a paper is correct by virtue of the fact that it is a paper. And then to Alex's point, people cite it, oh, well, how do you know it's right? Well, because it's a paper and like it was in a journal. But you're much more familiar with the research world than we are. Like, I like the idea of almost adding an additional piece to the traditional structure. You go through your abstracts and all this, a sub paragraph that says, why is this relevant, and challenge the researchers to answer that question. And then I also think maybe on that peer review board, having, maybe it's Alex and I on the peer review board as the intended end user. Does this make sense to this person? And if not, maybe we should revisit kind of where we're trying to get to with this. And that's not to harp on any one journal in particular, but when you see some of this stuff come out and it's like, single leg, this, that, and the other in, this sport that 5 people play, and why it's important to doing vertical jump. It's like, well, who cares? And I hate to put it that way, but like, I'm done with my rant. That's what I was getting at.
No, Drew, I've had kind of a very similar rant of, I think my family feels like they've become mildly scientifically literate just from hearing me bitches sometimes that I'm reading papers at home, and be like, hey guys, listen to this one. And even, my 22-year-old son who will go, well, that's dumb. Like, when I lay out the study design and the question they're trying, and he's like, so where's the control group? I'm like, very good. You're learning something.
Well done.
I just before this episode, I was scrolling through some of your stuff, and you were on one that was looking at like fitness test event correlations with like tactical tests, warrior test, battle drill kind of stuff. And it was across tactical populations. It was also firefighters and police. But the sheer number of publications you guys had to throw out in the process of determining what met inclusion criteria.
Oh, you're talking about our systematic review with occupational tests and physical fitness.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's why even when you look at a meta-analysis or a systematic review, whether it has a meta-analysis or not, you have to look carefully at the selection criteria, because we were specifically looking for papers that had correlations, or provided the data that we could calculate the correlations on our own. That if it was a paper that you could have done correlations, but then they just reported results of multivariate regression, we had to exclude it, because that was the inclusion exclusion criteria we selected before we even started searching.
Yeah. Well, that plus you had to exclude a bunch for methodological issues.
This is tons of stuff.
I don't think people, like, when you look at a meta-analysis, I don't think people look at the inclusion criteria section. They jump right to the findings and say, oh, this supports or doesn't support my preconceived bias before I even got in this.
A good systematic review should always have some sort of flow diagram that lays out, the search strategy, how many papers are identified, how many were, duplicates thrown out, all that stuff. That should be a part of what you're looking at when you look at a systematic review of, okay, well, they found these findings, but in what population? What criteria, what outcomes were they specifically looking at? So even within that space of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, there's still ones that are better done than others.
What have you seen? And this kind of circles back to something that we talked about before we jumped into the research conversation, which I could talk about this all day long, but in terms of best practices in the research space, when we talk about converting, we'll call them laboratory findings to the field, what have you seen amongst your colleagues or otherwise, as far as best practices go, to get that message across and actually have an impact, to the intended end user?
I think if we're talking human performance versus heat stress stuff,
go wherever you want with that.
Slightly different, so sometimes the research question is more basic, even in the human performance space. I can think of someone who's out at, I just brain cramped. I can picture him. I'm brain cramping his name. He's worked somewhere in the University of California system. He's a muscle physiologist. He looked at muscle fiber types and changes with training, and has gotten muscle biopsies from Olympic caliber weightlifters. That's some basic science stuff. So there's not always okay, well, what's that mean to the average everyday person? But other times there certainly is. And it really is incumbent on the scientist, on the author who's writing a paper, that's where your discussion section, your conclusions needs to lead to. What's all this mean? And that's where, in my role as a reviewer for a handful of different journals, where a lot of papers fall short. Either in the introduction, establishing why what they're going to do is important, and or when you get to the discussion section, well, what did they find? How does that fall into the context of what other people with similar questions have done, and how has this advanced our knowledge? How is this useful? So some journals are getting better about that they actually require a section of, I think the NSCA journals, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, I think they have a practical application section that is the end before you get to the references. I've got a couple papers in press on experimental physiology that right up front, you have to lead with what's new. You got 3 bullet points. And that's part of what you submit with along with the article. What's new? And you've got 100 words. No, there's 100, 3 bullets, 100, no, 3 bullets, 100 characters per bullet or something like that. You got to be succinct, and it's required.
Does that leave room for researchers to be able to go back and perhaps repeat an experiment and see if the conclusions play out? Because that's a critique that I've often heard in the sort of peer-reviewed space, is that you're always encouraged to find something new, find something new, find something new, but nobody ever really goes back and challenges existing research.
Yeah, replication crisis kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that definitely is, and that's a bias, because what does a journal want to have? A journal wants to have a good impact factor.
Yeah, there needs to be novelty. There needs to be reasons for news articles to get coverage. And
so journals don't like 2 things. They don't like just straight up replication studies, and they don't like negative findings.
Yeah,
but those are so important.
Yes, they are. Absolutely. And I wish more journal editors would, but on the business side of producing a journal,
yeah. God, I have so many questions now.
There needs to be a center for boring science. There needs to be like an institute that is responsible for like all the stuff that should be happening.
Well, I can't remember the name of the journal, but I had a colleague, this is years ago, who sarcastically referred to the journal as the journal of inconsequential results. Because it was all that's where all the papers that had no differences found. That's what seemed like most of what was in that particular journal. I don't even remember what the journal is at this point.
That's a better title for it.
Yeah, the Journal of Inconsequential Studies.
It's like a Harry Potter book. Do you? I want so badly to dive down this, but I want to also stay on the fringes because it could create another episode easily. But
we have numerous other episodes we could go into. We're already running out of time on this one. There's so many topics we haven't touched.
Okay, fine. This will be my last question. In the field of research, and specifically peer-reviewed research journals, what we're talking about now, do you have the sense that the business side outweighs the science side, or does the science side still hold sway over the business side?
I honestly don't have enough experience on the business side of journals. Certainly, the business side is a consideration. Journals want to have high impact factors, which means other scientists are citing what's in their journals, so it needs to be higher quality stuff. I've never been in the position to have enough insight really to give that the fair answer. I know they both matter. How much, I feel like I'd be giving an unfair answer if I tried to.
That's fine. I was looking for a super hot take, but I totally understand.
Yep.
We just got a negative findings question.
Yeah, sorry.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
That was responsible science, guys.
Oh man. Well, I feel
that's part of. I wish I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. Both my peers, both in the environmental physiology and in the human performance spaces, we all need to have some degree of humility. And sometimes the best answer is, I don't know. We can't be expected to always know the answer. On my outside the Army life, where I'm involved with the sport of weightlifting, as a coach, I'm not a physical therapist or athletic trainer. And if my athlete's hurt, I shouldn't be trying to fix that problem. I need to have some humility and go, yeah, I don't know. You need to go to talk to somebody else.
I think, and this is something I learned through teaching, frankly, I think you gain more legitimacy when you start admitting what you don't know. They start to trust what you say you know more if you are willing to acknowledge what you don't.
I totally agree with you. I don't trust the person who thinks they always have the answer.
But do you think, here we go down another, whatever. Do you think, Do you think that there's an inflection point in experience that you have to have kind of behind you before you're able to say, I don't know, and have that taken as a pro versus a con? Because I'm thinking of like, if I'm working with a brand new strength coach who doesn't know anything and all you hear is, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, versus someone who's way more experienced. And I think to you guys' point can say that, and that can be received by the athlete as, oh, this guy, like, you see what I'm getting at? I just wonder if there's like a,
Sure. Yeah. If you've got someone who's a real newbie and they keep saying, I don't know, it's because you need to get some experience, pal.
Mhm.
Or maybe you're underprepared for the job versus I guess it's a slightly different take on it of I don't know versus that's outside my expertise.
well, let me find out.
Yeah. Or let me find out, you know what, I don't know the answer to that one.
I'll get back to you.
That's not my expertise. I can't adequately address that one. Here's what I can address.
Mhm.
Versus the just ignorant.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Man, like Alex, like you said, we could like, there's a million more episodes to be had here.
We haven't even talked about what I did stuff with the ACFT. That'll make people hate me.
I have a sheet of notes next to me with like a list of topics that Dave could talk about that would be relevant for the podcast. It includes ACFT research stuff. It includes pregnancy and postpartum research stuff. It includes body mass index, body composition kind of stuff. There's so many other topics. We're out of time on this one, but it seems like we might be asking you to come back at some
Well,
point.
hey, maybe if your listeners don't hate this episode too badly, you guys maybe will want to have me back someday and we can talk other stuff.
Well, and this is, and I don't remember your exact words, but not 15 minutes ago, you were saying that you don't have a huge body research, and that's just patently false.
Well,
yeah.
So here's my perspective. My office wife from my PhD program. She and I we started and finished together. Day one through graduation. She's a dear friend. And she has been nominated for editor-in-chief of one of our top sports science journals. She has 4 or 5 times the number of publications I have. Our career started at the same time because we literally graduated on the same day together.
But has she joined the Army twice?
No, she has not.
There you go.
I've got that one on her.
You've got that one on her.
No, I guess maybe this is an area to maybe where we can start wrapping things up here. But, you know, as scientists, we also, you know, there's more than the traditional academic model of I'm going to get my PhD and then stay in academia and do teaching and research. I've had a very fulfilling scientific career while serving as an officer on active duty in the Army. And there's people who have had very fulfilling careers working for industry, whether it's for Gatorade or some other. I just say Gatorade because I have a friend who works there. I have another friend who works at the Nike labs out in Oregon. And it's not fair to measure us all on the same yardstick, which is what I was just doing with my ex-office wife.
Yeah.
Because I was measuring us by the same yardstick of the number of publications. But we do entirely different things. We're both thermoregulatory physiologists who trained with the same person, but we do different things. And she and I were actually getting kind of philosophical. I saw her at the ACSM annual meeting a couple months ago. We were getting philosophical about this stuff. And, you know, we've both gone down different paths. We do different things, but we both have very fulfilling careers. So, yeah,
That's
so it's
awesome.
not just about the number of papers. I'm perfectly content with what I have.
That's awesome. And like we said, here, let's officially close this one out with the promise being that we will dive down these other rabbit holes again.
Sounds like a plan.
Deal.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. This has been fun.